Sir.
All right, Commissioner Pulliam, the floor is yours, madam.
Thank you, Mayor Johnson. I appreciate that. Thank you, everyone, for being here on today. We are going to continue. This will be part 2 of our short-term rental session, and I am actually going to turn it over to Administrator Dowse.
Thank you for that, Commissioner. As you know, Deputy Administrator Charles Jackson has led the efforts as far as researching and planning, and so while you have turned it over to me, I will now be turning it over to Deputy Administrator Mr. Jackson. So if you would, please approach.
Good morning, Mayor, members of the Commission. You have 2 documents in your possession this morning. The first is the agenda. As you can see, we have a list of guests, both internally and external stakeholders today. They will be speaking on issues of taxation and enforcement. So as they come and speak, please be mindful of why they're here and the type of expertise that they can provide. The second document is a larger document, it's 11 by 17 handout. It is a meeting recap of the May 2023 meeting. It highlights 10 key areas that I think the Commissioner should be aware of that need further discussion. And these are things that Director Delaney will touch upon today. And with that being said, I'll turn it over to Director Delaney.
Just in case some of you, like me, my glasses don't work the best, we printed it out for you, and we have a little packet for you with the slideshow and just some basic information enclosed. So if you would like one, make sure y'all get one real quick. So inside your folder, you'll have the actual PowerPoint slides, and I'll be candid, it's not a lot, not a very long one. We've done this exercise at a preliminary stage, so we're going to run through a couple of the highlights from the last meeting. And I'm going to grab a piece of paper here. So I'm going to take some notes because this is an interactive session. We're all going to participate and give feedback on how things should move forward. So in our last meeting, which was in May of 2023, we looked at the definition of short-term rentals. We highlighted some of the current county codes of ordinances and the zoning ordinance and the business licensing requirements regarding rental homes. We reviewed the southeastern jurisdictions with the short-term rental ordinance. We did a roundtable and we had some discussion. The most important thing that we wanted to address in that first meeting was a disclaimer that said that these potential short-term regulations would not apply to hotels, motels, inns, and extended stay hotels. So we don't want any confusion. We're going to keep that disclaimer out front that this is not in regards to motels, hotels, and extended stay. But it is not limited to boarding houses and lodging houses either. So rooming houses, tourist houses, and individuals providing long-term, more than 30 days of rental or residential dwelling. This is not going to apply to them. All right? So that was the main point of what we talked about. I'm going to start with a definition just to be on the safe side, because sometimes I don't remember everything from May. So with that, we'll start with the definition again of what a short-term rental is. One of the things that was talked about most commonly was if the state of Georgia has its own definition of a short-term rental, and it does not. But we did look at other states, and then we looked at other jurisdictions within the state of Georgia to see how they defined a short-term rental. And essentially, it is on the screen in the middle, and it is providing a period of less than 30 consecutive days for a fee for a person to stay. So I want to note that North Carolina is one of the few states that actually defines it differently, and they do 90 days or less. So that is the most basic approach to short-term rentals. So we also looked at the first meeting, some of the short-term rental types. We looked at hosted sharing, which is where the primary occupant of a residence remains on the site with the guest. We looked at number 2, unhosted sharing, where the primary occupants of a resident vacate the unit while it is rented to a short-term guest. And then we looked at 3, dedicated vacation rentals, where there are no primary occupants. So that was some of the things that we highlighted at the beginning back in May. The goal I am to understand of today's session is for us to talk about the pros and cons of short-term rental ordinances. So before I go into the pros and cons, were there any questions that may have stemmed or been lingering from May of 2023? No? Okay. All right. So with that being said, we'll go right on into the pros and cons. We're going to start with the benefits of short-term rental ordinances. One of the things that we hear a lot about, we highlighted it and we turned it into these 5 categories to the benefits of short-term rentals. And they're on your screen right here. And of course, there's community and quality of life. The regulations, they can help maintain the character and tranquility of residential neighborhoods, reducing disruptions caused by transient guests. This is probably the most common complaint that we get, regardless of if your neighborhood is multi-million-dollar or $100,000. One of the common things that we hear is that it erodes the fabric of the community feel when you have a lot of residents within a community that are transient, and the population changes quite frequently when you have homeowners and renters that are coming and going frequently. The second benefit of short-term rentals is fair competition with hotels and traditional bread and breakfasts. The regulations can level the playing field between the short-term rentals and the traditional lodging establishments by imposing similar rules and taxes. So that's just fair competition. That one doesn't need a whole lot of explanation. We have number 3, which is tax revenue generation. One of the things I think a lot of people don't think about, and this is our role in government to think about, is that when you have an influx of a population and it's changing rapidly, you also have an increased demand and pull on your resources with regards to the police, with regards to traffic, and regards to fire services and code enforcement. So we don't want to make light of the fact that that there are increased costs occasionally with short-term rental ordinances, and then just enforcing them in general. So there is a revenue that comes from it, and it should be used to reinvest in local infrastructure and services. And then the fourth benefit of actually having a short-term rental ordinance is the perceived safety and regulations compliance. Ordinances should ensure that short-term rental properties meet safety and health standards, protecting both the guests and the hosts. Now, if you do this, and you notice I said sure where it says should, where it says can. Again, you're talking about additional services and resources coming from the county in order to accomplish this. So that means some inspections on a monthly, quarterly, annual basis, and things of that nature for compliance. And then number 5, you have housing availability. One of the benefits of short-term rental we saw mostly during the COVID era was that the regulations provided for opportunity for housing for people who were sold their homes and then couldn't find a new home. And then just in general, you have some challenges with conversion of long-term rental units into short-term rental units, just so that we can help meet the housing crisis that is nationwide. So these 5 up here highlight the benefits of a short-term rental ordinance. I am going to go into the cons, but before I switch to the cons, are there any questions I can field on this portion of it? All right. Hearing none, I'll go to the next section, which is the cons, or the drawbacks of short-term rental ordinances. So this one is going to be up for debate depending on who you're talking to, but we're going to go through them anyway. So some of the drawbacks of short-term rentals is limiting of property rights. Once a person owns the property, regulations and things of that nature can limit a homeowner's ability to rent out their properties as they see fit, and potentially infringing upon the property rights. But if you're adjacent to one of those property rights, sometimes you feel like that rental is infringing on yours as a property owner. But we have to be careful about limiting property rights and how we regulate that and what those ramifications could be. Number 2 is reduce income for hosts. So the stricter rules can lead to decreased income for hosts, especially for those who rely on short-term rentals to make ends meet. At this point, I would say from the planning and development department standpoint, most of our complaints about short-term rentals come around the Masters Week and then graduation from high school and college, which is in May. So that's when we get the biggest influx. We're starting to hear a little bit more around Ironman with regards to the short term, but you have 2 major instances in our county that are highly celebrated, and they tend to come with a short-term rental kind of audience. So we want to be careful. This is also an opportunity for the average person who might just have a basic need or want to get a vacation money. This is one of the avenues that they sometimes use. So I think that, this is a very valid and very good point about people who are doing it 1 or 2 times a year versus a business. Okay. And then another drawback, number 3, is the complexity and administrative burden. While we would like to believe that everyone would be in compliance with the regulations, it can be cumbersome to enforce, because now you have neighbors calling saying, I think this is a rental, and then you're sending someone out there to double check. And sometimes it's not a rental, sometimes it's family, sometimes they've actually rented the property through a realtor and not as a short-term rental. So there requires a certain amount of resources, and in addition to that, the back and forth of trying to determine what is a short-term rental versus a legitimate residential renting. Because remember, this wouldn't apply to people who stayed 30 days or more. So if someone rented a house for 60, 90 days and it turned over every 60, 90 days, they would not be subject to the short-term rental ordinance. Okay. The next one, number 4, is the economic impact on some of the local businesses. One of the highlights of living in Augusta and being part of Richmond County is the activity that I spoke of, the Masters. People come here for the PGA, the Women's LPGA. They come for the Masters tournament. They come for Ironman. They come from Arts in the Heart. Most of you participated in Arts in the Heart. So it is a huge benefit, and it brings tourists in when they have options other than hotels, especially if they want to stay somewhere that has a kitchen and things of that nature, especially for people who would like to travel with their family. So short-term rentals do offer that opportunity, and it helps some of the local businesses to have people who come to town who want to eat at small non-chain restaurants and do a little shopping and things of that nature. So there are huge economic benefits also to not having a short-term rental ordinance. A drawback number 5 is the risk of driving activity underground. Now, this is something we're already, hearing about. You can write an ordinance, but you got to enforce it, and then you have to encourage hosts to operate openly. But then there comes the question of, do I register with a site? Don't I register with a site? Is it underground if, say, for instance, I've had an Airbnb family for the last 3-4 years, and now they don't want to go through an agency. We rent directly to that person. So the question of driving activity underground, discovering it, and then figuring out a penalty becomes a challenge in and of itself. And it can make it harder for us to enforce the rules, and it can create some frustration for those that are following the regulations. Drawback number 6 is the ineffectiveness in solving housing issues. For those, some people believe that short-term rentals are the answer to some of the housing challenges. However, I think it's a misnomer because of the cost. Sometimes it's very cost prohibitive to stay that in a short-term rental for a long time. So you want to make sure that if you're talking about housing, you're talking about housing with the intent of it lasting for at least, say, for instance, a school term, a school year, not something that's going to change over every 30 days and things of that nature. So it could further perpetuate the feeling that short-term rentals are answering the housing problem, and they're really not. They're two separate things. So with that being said, at this point, we're trying to figure out how the commission would like to move forward. Of course, we can field any questions about some of the pros and the cons, and just offer some information. I will say that as of today, there were about 676 properties in Richmond County that were available for short-term rentals. So I did look into that a little bit to see what the current temperature and environment is for it in Richmond County. And so we have about 676 rentals out there in Richmond County.
Thank you, Director. Before I get into the queue, I got a question. You mentioned potentially some of these being operated as a business. As you know, we have a neighboring county that I think they have an issue in a neighborhood where property is being advertised and rented exclusively for the effort of being an Airbnb. Do we have any ordinances or anything against that? How does that pertain to our discussions here today?
As far as ordinances, anytime you own, technically, if you own more than one property and you're renting one, you should have a business license and register that business. So you have what we call a residential property management code that we use to identify people who have rental properties for residential purposes. But if you're talking about what, I hate to speak on other municipalities things, but I'll say this: what they're operating is more of a hospitality house / event center for special events, weddings, and things like that. That is a separate thing from a short-term rental. That is what's happening. Of course, they're having events at these larger estates and things of that nature. So that is the short-term rental ordinance would not capture that. And that is the challenge. When I looked at several of the municipalities, and my deputy also looked at several of them, they're still facing that same challenge. So when you have a wedding party coming and they want to rent for 2 weeks, and the wedding's going to be somewhere in that 2-week range, they're typically going through the Airbnb sites and things of that nature. But for one-day events, it's really hard to catch, because by the time you get there, the event's happened. From a code enforcement perspective, we find out about it when the people show up and start parking on the street. The neighbors call, and then by the time everyone gets there, the police gets there, the event is typically, 3/4 of the way over. So that's the challenge with trying to, I think what we really probably need to do is look at how we regulate hospitality houses and events and things of that nature, because the states are the new event center.
All right.
Commissioner.
Should I recognize the commissioner from the second?
I'm chairing the meeting,
Oh,
so
I'm
I was going to
sorry.
call. That's okay. Not a problem, Mayor. Not a problem. Not a problem at all.
Go right ahead.
Okay, Commissioner McKnight, you have the floor.
Yeah, I got a quick question for Ms. Delaney, Director Delaney. This weekend, for instance, I was out of town for my son's parents' weekend, and we rented a Airbnb for 2 nights. And I got somebody that mentioned this to me today about us renting, the owners who own these places who don't live in town, but yet they rent them short term. What about, I hadn't heard anything about trash. Like yesterday, for instance, before we left, we put trash can, but we weren't told to put the trash on the street. So what happens when the owners are not living there and the trash piles up? What do we do about that? We have issues already with trash in Augusta. People calling us about not having it picked up. What happens when the owner doesn't live here and you have people coming in and out renting, and trash sits there in the driveway, yet not put on the street, and it just sits there? What do we do about that? What are we going to do?
I would say that at this point, a short-term rental ordinance won't fix that. That is a challenge that we face in code enforcement in general. Sometimes with regular property owners, they don't even have to be transient population. What we do typically, if we get a complaint, we go out there, we look into it, and then if it's sitting there, we call environmental services, and environmental services will come and pick up the trash. But in general, I can tell you that the ordinance won't keep people from picking up the trash. Now, depending on if the commission decides to go that route, you could put some things in place. We have some samples of some other short-term rental ordinances, and some of the more aggressive ones, or I won't say aggressive, more comprehensive ones. I think that's the best way to say it. I think if you flip to the back, if you just flip it over, this Georgia cities, Savannah probably has the most comprehensive one. But I will tell you that there's no foolproof way for us to ensure that will happen, because we have that issue currently with residents who live in town.
Any other questions from my colleagues? Yes, sir.
Quick question.
Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Commissioner. Is it permissible to operate a full-time Airbnb if you don't live there? You have several residences throughout the county. Is it permissible under?
Yes, they would have a business license, and they would register as a residential management property. Property management. Yes, definitely.
Thank you, Director Delaney. No further questions. I don't have any questions. My colleagues don't have any questions. And so your question you posed to us was, how would the commission like to move forward? So that is something that we would have to discuss as a full commission, to see if we are wanting to move forward with creating an ordinance. Thank you for the presentation, though, and what you put together, especially with the pros and cons, because I think, as you mentioned many times, a lot of this is misnomers. And so sometimes people don't know the legalities behind short-term rentals, and especially the property management piece, that you can in fact own several homes and rent them out as a property management company or as an LLC. So thank you very much for that.
And if I may make a recommendation,
Yes, ma'am.
I think that based on what we see in the planning and development department, from the code enforcement side to the planning and the zoning side, we think that this is something that that warrants being watched, but we don't recommend writing an ordinance at this time. We think that based on the fact that it surrounds master's and high school graduation and college graduation in May, the department doesn't recommend it at this time, but we do think that we should check back in and monitor this and provide an update to you. And that would conclude our recommendation.
Okay. I did have one question, because this is something that came up to me several times. Separating the calls that you receive from loud parties in a short-term rental versus it just being someone's home. Mm-hmm. The rules are the same, correct? So you can't, if I'm calling because Commissioner Scott is my neighbor and, you know, she had a graduation party that happened to be really loud, that's her home, and she owns that home. Now, I might be upset because she didn't invite me, but you know, and that's not to make light of the situation, but in all honesty, because a party at your home versus a party at a short-term rental, they're treated the same.
Correct. The noise ordinance applies regardless of the type of ownership.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Administrator Dowse, did we have any further presentations?
The agenda that's prepared allows for enforcement and collection impact from some of those individuals that were asked to attend. I don't know if the commission seeks value in hearing what their comments may be, or if you would rather take this information as presented by Ms. Delaney and then continue to determine if you would like to move forward, or if you feel that Augusta has as much information as needed concerning this point, and then we'll continue to monitor the actions over the years.
And that's my colleagues. Would you like to hear from law enforcement as well as taxation from that standpoint? Okay, so we will. Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Yes, we could run down the list, starting with the sheriff's office, if the representative here to maybe offer some comments to today's discussion.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Colonel Chu from the Sheriff's Office. I don't know what questions you have of me, but I'll be glad to answer anything that you need to know.
Okay, I can start off. Are you receiving what you would call more calls, or how are you quantifying the calls that you receive from short-term rentals versus just someone that owns the home, a property owner?
We've actually had minimal calls as far as, you know, any incidents that are happening at short-term rentals. We have a lot of calls for loud music, etc., but that's all around. That's for, you know, whether it's a business, whether it's a home, or whether it's a short-term rental. So we really haven't seen a spike in any incidents in our jurisdiction.
Thank you. Colleagues, any further questions? No. No further questions. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
And next, we will have a representative from the Marshal's office.
Good morning, everyone. We have no impact with regards to this. We've seen no impact, and so we stand with Director Delaney and her recommendation. Thank you. Any questions?
No, sir. Thank you so much.
And we have Chief Burton to talk about from a fire code perspective.
Good morning.
Good morning.
From a fire perspective, the code is really specific in how it views or as it relates to occupancy type. So the fire, as it relates to fire, is as long as there's no occupancy change, meaning it still remains residential, it falls outside of our jurisdiction. So we would not inspect or permit or in any way as long as it remains residential.
Thank you, Chief Burton.
Thank you.
And from a taxation and revenue collections perspective, we have the tax assessor's office and the tax commissioner's office.
Good morning. As it relates to the tax commissioner's office, since we are just the billing and collecting entity for the city, it has no impact on our office directly.
Thank you.
All right. Good morning. So short-term rentals are I guess a constant debate on how to address as an appraised property for taxation. We're kind of in a sit and watch mode as well. When we look at these properties, we really have to separate the business value from the real estate value. So we kind of, at this time, observe them as either owner-occupied or owner-owned rental properties. And more often than not, they're treated as every other residential property. So the tax implications at this point are more related to state and local hotel tax, if any at all. And so we're not appraising them differently than we would regular residential property, unless it's an Airbnb complex, I guess, within a hotel. Then it might be looked at separately. To my knowledge, we don't have anything that's, I guess, by building or by neighborhood where the character of that property has changed from a traditional single family or a traditional long-term rental neighborhood to a short-term rental community. And if that character changes where the balance shifts, and let's just say, I'm going to grab something out of the air. If the J.B. White's building became 90% Airbnbs, then at that time it might be appropriate to look at a different approach to valuation. But at this point, we're just kind of observing and seeing what happens. Ms. Delaney mentioned that there's about 600, 700 rentals in the community. I mean, that's pretty small number. That's less than 1% of all of our available residential units. And so at this time, it's not a significant impact.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
And lastly, I think it's fitting that we offer the public to weigh in on this matter as well.
Do I have anyone in the audience that would like to weigh in on short-term rentals? Going once, twice, 3 times? Okay. I do have Mayor Johnson. I have you in the queue. Yes, sir.
Yeah, Madam Commissioner, I'd like to ask Director Delaney, just got a text. I get several complaints from neighbors about these short-term rentals. Outside of Masters Week, Iron Man, there's been a couple noted in certain neighborhoods where people have bought investment properties, they're using them as full-time Airbnbs. And earlier you mentioned that a property owner can have a business model where they apply for a business license. Is it permissible to have a business license in a neighborhood that's designated R1?
If it is a residential, for residential rental, yes.
It is, okay.
Yeah, because technically every type of realtor or real estate agency that brokers rental property for someone, say for instance TDY, they are operating with as a business within that particular neighborhood. The problem or the challenge might really be with the number of units being used residentially and how frequently it's turning over. I think the turnover becomes the biggest challenge. But yes, residential property management applies to all rental properties other than the one you live in. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner.
Yes, sir. Miss okay. You don't have one?
I was just going to thank Ms. Delaney, and I appreciate what she had to say today and her recommendations, and maybe just we ought to keep continuing to monitor this and go with her recommendations.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Thank you, Director Delaney. If there are no further questions or nothing from anyone, then we can call this work session to an end. Thank you all for coming out, and enjoy the rest of your week. See you tomorrow at commission meeting.